Jessica Taylor had tried to live simply, fixing engines, wiping grease from her hands, keeping her head down while the past stayed buried under the sound of wrenches and the hiss of steam. But the past never stayed buried, not for people like her. It returned on a Tuesday morning, with rain tapping on the garage windows and a cold wind sliding through the cracks of the door. She was replacing a belt on a truck engine when she heard the chime above the door. Jessica wiped her hands on a rag, stepping around the lift, expecting to see a regular customer or maybe a lost traveler. Instead, she froze. Standing in the doorway was David Crow. His dark coat dripped rain onto the concrete, and he stood there with that same crooked grin, the scar on his jaw pulling when he smiled. She had not seen him in 12 years, not since the night flames tore through the warehouse, not since they both ran in opposite directions, leaving the city behind with police sirens echoing under blood-red skies. The wrench slipped in Jessica's hand, clanging to the floor. David's eyes flickered, catching the sound, but he didn't flinch. "Jess," he said, voice low, calm like the hush before a gunshot. "You look well." Jessica crossed her arms, feeling the weight of the hidden knife in her back pocket, the habit she had never shaken even after all these years. "What do you want, David?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the storm building under her ribs. David stepped inside, the bell jingling again before the door swung shut, cutting off the sound of rain. He looked around the garage, eyes scanning the tools, the organized chaos she had built for herself. His gaze paused on the shelf where she kept the old photo, turned down so no one would see. He nodded once, almost like a silent apology, before meeting her eyes again. "I came to warn you," he said, pulling a small worn envelope from inside his coat, placing it gently on her workbench. Jessica did not move, her eyes locked on him. David took a breath, that scar pulling again, as his jaw tightened. "He's back, Jess. The man we thought died in that fire. The man we thought we left behind." Jessica felt her throat tighten, a phantom taste of ash returning to her tongue, memories flashing like lightning. The man in the shadows of that warehouse, the deals gone wrong, the fire that swallowed evidence and sins alike. She stepped forward, picking up the envelope, her hands steady even as her pulse roared in her ears. Inside was a photograph, old but clear, of a man with steel-gray eyes and a cruel smile, standing beside a black sedan. The date on the back was from a month ago. "How?" Jessica asked, her voice softer now, the word a breath against the storm outside. David shook his head, running a hand through his wet hair. "I don't know, but he's looking for us. He wants payback, Jess. And he's starting with you." The air felt heavy, the rain outside turning into a downpour that drummed against the garage roof like distant gunfire. Jessica set the photograph down, fingers brushing the edges, memories crawling up her spine like cold fingers. "Why me first?" she asked. David's eyes softened, regret flickering in the blue depths. "Because you were the one who ruined his plans that night. You were the one who got away with the ledger." Jessica's jaw tightened, the memory of that leather-bound book, the codes and names, the weight of it in her hands as the flames roared around her. She had buried it deep, miles away, hoping it would die with the past. "I don't have it anymore," she said. But they both knew it didn't matter. The man would come for her, whether she had the ledger or not. David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Jess, you need to leave. Disappear. He has people watching. He has money, connections. You can't fight this." Jessica met his eyes, a small, humorless smile tugging at her lips. "You know I won't run." David sighed, looking away, the stormlight casting shadows across his scarred face. "I know," he whispered. Outside, a lightning flash lit up the dark clouds and thunder cracked so loud it rattled the tools on her wall. Jessica turned, pulling the garage door down, locking it in place. "Then we prepare," she said, her voice firm, the storm in her eyes matching the one screaming outside. David nodded, the weight of old debts hanging in the air between them. Jessica moved back to her workbench, pulling out a heavy bag she hadn't touched in years. Inside were tools, weapons, memories of who she used to be before she tried to be normal. She strapped a holster to her hip, checked the knife in her boot, and met David's eyes once more. "Tell me everything you know," she said. The rain roared louder, the wind howling against the doors as David began to speak, and Jessica listened, the storm within her rising, ready for the fight that was coming. Jessica wiped the rain from her face as she locked the garage, the envelope with Ethan Marlowe's photo burning a hole in her jacket pocket. David waited by the truck, his eyes scanning the empty street, the wet asphalt glistening under the cold streetlights. They did not speak as they left, tires hissing on the soaked roads, the storm clouds rolling low over the rooftops. Inside the truck, David's voice was low. "You remember how he was, Jess. Calm, quiet. But when he snapped, it was like watching a wolf tear apart its prey." Jessica kept her eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, her mind tracing old scars and the smell of burning wood, the taste of ash, the fear she had felt that night. "He should have died in that fire," she replied, her voice steady. David looked out the window, the darkness hiding his expression. "But he didn't." They drove through the outskirts, past silent houses with dark windows, past fields where the wind bent the grass low. Jessica felt the weight of each mile, the past catching up with every turn. They turned down an old gravel road leading to a cabin hidden among tall pines, a place Jessica had kept for emergencies. It smelled of old wood and damp earth as she unlocked the door, the hinges creaking softly. She set down her bag, moving quietly, checking the windows, the locks, every shadow. David followed her inside, his eyes tired, his movements slow. "You think he'll come tonight?" he asked. Jessica glanced at him, then out the window where the trees moved like dark waves. "If he knows I'm here, yes." She checked her pistol, the cold metal familiar against her palm, before sliding it back into the holster. David dropped into a chair, rubbing his hands together, the silence stretching between them. She lit a small lantern, its glow pushing back the darkness. Jessica pulled out her notebook, flipping through pages filled with names, notes, sketches of places they had been, things they had done, mistakes they had made. She added Ethan's name, underlining it, a reminder of the unfinished chapter that had returned to find her. "What are you writing?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A plan," Jessica said. "I won't be hunted again." They took turns watching the windows, the hours stretching as rain tapped against the glass, the storm building in quiet waves. David dozed off, his head against the wall, while Jessica sat with her back to the door, listening to every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wind. Her mind replayed the warehouse fire, the screams, the smoke, the moment she saw Ethan's eyes through the flames before she ran with the ledger in her hands. At dawn, the rain slowed to a drizzle, mist rising from the ground like ghosts. Jessica stepped outside, breathing in the cold air, the scent of wet pine clearing her thoughts. She looked at the forest, each tree a possible hiding place, each shadow a threat. Her fingers curled into fists. She would not run. She would not hide. If Ethan came, she would face him, and this time she would end it. She turned back to the cabin, seeing David standing in the doorway, his eyes meeting hers with a silent understanding. They both knew the storm was not over. It was just beginning. Dawn painted the sky in cold gray light as Jessica brewed coffee in the small cabin kitchen, the bitter scent grounding her nerves. David sat at the table, fingers drumming on the wood, his eyes distant, haunted by memories neither of them could fully bury. Outside, the forest dripped with the last rain, mist curling around the trees like smoke. It was quiet, too quiet, and Jessica felt the weight of that silence in her bones. "He'll come here," David finally said, breaking the quiet. Jessica set the coffee down in front of him, her green eyes steady. "Then we'll be ready." She checked the pistol, sliding it into her holster, feeling the cold metal against her side. The knife in her boot pressed lightly against her ankle as she moved, reminding her she was not helpless, not anymore. They spent the morning setting up the cabin, reinforcing the windows with boards, setting up makeshift alarms using cans and wire around the perimeter. Each clang of a hammer was a promise, each knot tied in the wire a silent vow. David watched her, seeing the precision in her movements, the focus in her eyes. "You've changed," he said. Jessica paused, looking at him over her shoulder. "We both have." After the traps were set, they sat at the table, the map of the surrounding woods spread between them. David traced possible entry points, old trails Ethan could use to get close without being seen. Jessica marked them with red ink, drawing lines of defense, fallback points if they were forced to retreat. "We can't run forever," Jessica said. David nodded, the lines on his face deepening. "No, we finish it here." They ate a cold lunch, the tension in the room heavy, every creak of the wood making them glance at the windows. The hours passed, the sun rising higher, shadows shifting as the light moved across the cabin floor. Jessica cleaned her weapons, checked the traps again, moved with quiet efficiency, while David paced, the silence between them filled with unspoken fears. As afternoon settled, a crow landed on the porch railing, cawing loudly before taking off into the trees. Jessica's eyes followed it, her instincts tightening like a coiled spring. She moved to the window, scanning the tree line, the stillness too sharp, too deliberate. "He's here," she whispered. David stepped beside her, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "How do you know?" Jessica's eyes narrowed, scanning the shifting shadows. "Because I would be." They waited, the cabin silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Minutes stretched like hours, the tension pulling tight around them. Then a branch snapped outside, sharp and clear, followed by the soft rustle of feet on wet leaves. Jessica's breath slowed, her mind sharpening, every sound amplified as adrenaline surged through her veins. David moved to the back door, checking the lock, while Jessica positioned herself near the window, eyes on the tree line. Another crack, closer this time, a shadow moving between the trees. Jessica lifted the pistol, the weight steady in her hands. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, the forest silent, waiting. A figure stepped from the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confidence of a predator. Even from a distance, Jessica recognized the cold posture, the way he scanned the cabin, the slight tilt of his head as he assessed the traps. Ethan Marlowe, alive, unbroken, coming for them. Jessica felt the past crash into her, the flames, the screams, the way Ethan had looked at her that night, promising revenge with a single cold stare. She gripped the pistol tighter, forcing herself to breathe, to stay in the moment. "David?" she called softly. He returned to her side, his eyes widening as he saw Ethan step closer. "He's alone," David said, almost a question. Jessica shook her head. "No, he never is." She could feel it, the way the forest seemed to close in, the air thick with tension, the promise of violence hanging heavy. Ethan stopped near the edge of the clearing, lifting his hand in a mock greeting, the smile on his face sharp, cruel. Jessica met his gaze through the window, her finger hovering near the trigger, the storm inside her matching the cold calculation in Ethan's eyes. This was it. The past had come for her, and she would not run. She would not hide. Not this time. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, the wind shifting the mist around him like restless spirits. His dark coat moved slightly with each cold breeze, and his eyes never left the cabin. Jessica felt the air tighten, her pulse steady despite the tremor in the world around her. She adjusted her grip on the pistol, stepping back from the window to avoid the glare of the glass. "He's testing us," she said quietly. David checked the back window, the traps they had set glinting in the fading light. "He knows we're ready," David replied, sweat shining on his forehead despite the cold. The minutes stretched, the silence heavy enough to crack as Ethan took a single step forward, then another, moving with the deliberate calm of a man who had all the time in the world. He stopped just before the first wire trap, his eyes flicking down, a small smile curling across his lips as he stepped over it without hesitation. Jessica watched, her mind calculating, adjusting the plan. "He's alone, but he's expecting us to act first," she murmured. David glanced at her, fear and trust battling in his eyes. "So, what do we do?" Jessica's jaw tightened. "We wait." Ethan circled the cabin slowly, studying every window, every door, as if memorizing the structure. He paused by the porch, bending down to examine the wires before standing, looking directly into the window where Jessica had been moments before. For a moment, everything was still, the forest holding its breath, the mist swirling like ghosts between the trees. Then, without warning, Ethan turned and walked back toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there. David let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Is he gone?" Jessica shook her head. "No, he's waiting for dark." They moved quickly, checking the traps, repositioning the alarms, and preparing for what they knew was coming. Jessica reloaded her pistol, the click of the magazine sliding into place sharp in the heavy silence. She looked at David, seeing the fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt in her own bones, but layered under a steady determination. "We end this tonight," she said. As the last light drained from the sky, darkness wrapped around the cabin like a shroud. The forest outside became a wall of shadows, each one a potential threat. They waited, every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind sharpening their senses. Hours passed, the tension a constant grinding weight in their chests. Then it came. A soft click near the back door, the quiet sound of a wire being cut. Jessica's eyes snapped open, and she gestured for David to move to cover. Another sound, the faintest creak of a footstep on the porch. Jessica moved silently, positioning herself near the door, the pistol steady in her hand, her breathing controlled. The door handle turned slowly, deliberately, before stopping. A pause. Then the door opened with sudden force, the cold night air rushing in as Ethan stepped inside, his own weapon raised. For a moment, time slowed, their eyes locking, the history between them crackling in the air like lightning. Jessica fired first, the flash lighting the dark room, the shot grazing Ethan's shoulder as he ducked to the side. He fired back, the bullet slamming into the wooden frame behind Jessica, splinters raining down. David shouted, taking cover as Jessica moved, firing again, forcing Ethan back toward the door. But Ethan was fast, moving with the deadly grace of a predator, rolling to the side and taking aim. Jessica felt the burn as a bullet sliced across her arm, but she did not slow, her eyes locked on Ethan as she returned fire. The cabin echoed with the sounds of gunfire, the sharp cracks tearing through the silence, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the cold air. Ethan retreated to the doorway, blood darkening his sleeve, his eyes still cold, still calculating. "You can't stop this, Jessica," he hissed, his voice a cold promise. Jessica stepped forward, her pistol steady despite the pain in her arm. "Watch me." Ethan fired again, but Jessica was ready, dropping to the side, the bullet missing by inches. She rolled, came up on one knee, and fired twice. The first shot struck Ethan's leg, sending him stumbling back, and the second hit his shoulder, spinning him around before he collapsed on the porch, his gun skidding across the wood. The silence that followed was deafening, the only sound the ragged breathing of Jessica and David as they stared at Ethan's fallen form. Jessica lowered her weapon, her arm throbbing, her breath fogging in the cold air. She stepped toward Ethan, who looked up at her with hate burning in his eyes. "It's over," Jessica said, her voice steady, final. Ethan tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as his eyes closed, unconscious. Jessica stood over him, the storm inside her finally quieting as she realized the past had come and she had faced it, unbroken. Jessica stood on the porch, the cold air biting at the blood on her arm, the pistol still warm in her hand. Ethan lay at her feet, unconscious, blood pooling beneath him, mixing with the rainwater that dripped from the edge of the roof. David stepped outside, his face pale, eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice shaking. Jessica looked down at Ethan, the man who had haunted her nightmares for years, the man who had crawled out of the past to destroy everything she had rebuilt. "Not yet," she replied. They dragged Ethan inside, tying his hands and feet with thick rope, securing him to the heavy chair in the center of the room. David checked the knots twice, his hands trembling as he worked. Jessica sat across from Ethan, her green eyes locked on his pale face, waiting for him to wake. The cabin smelled of blood and rain, the lantern casting flickering shadows on the walls as the wind howled outside. Ethan groaned, his head rolling to the side before his eyes fluttered open. He blinked, confusion giving way to cold fury as he realized where he was. "Jessica," he rasped, a twisted smile forming on his lips despite the pain. "You should have killed me." Jessica leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, the pistol resting on the table beside her. "I will if I have to," she said calmly. Ethan laughed, the sound sharp, echoing in the small cabin. "You always were soft." David stepped forward, but Jessica raised a hand, stopping him. Her eyes never left Ethan's as she spoke. "Why are you here, Ethan? Why now?" Ethan's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Because you owe me," he said, his voice low, deadly. "You took the ledger, Jess. You destroyed everything I built." Jessica's jaw tightened, memories of flames and screams flashing through her mind. "That ledger was a death sentence for innocent people, Ethan. You were using it to blackmail, to control. I did what I had to do." Ethan's eyes narrowed, the hatred in them burning like a wildfire. "You think you're a hero?" he spat. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing, Jess. You're just a mechanic hiding in a garage pretending you're clean." Jessica felt the words hit, but she didn't flinch. She had spent years trying to leave that life behind, to build something good, something honest. But the past had a way of finding you, no matter how far you ran. David moved to stand beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "What do we do with him?" he asked quietly. Jessica's eyes stayed on Ethan, her mind racing. "We find out who else is coming," she said. Ethan laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think this ends with me? You think I'm the only one looking for you?" His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "There are others, Jess. People who want what you stole. People who will burn everything you care about to the ground to get it." Jessica's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, the storm inside her building again. "Who?" she demanded. Ethan's smile returned, slow and mocking. "Why would I tell you?" he taunted. Jessica stood, grabbing the pistol and pressing it against his wounded shoulder, the cold barrel making him flinch. "Because if you don't, I will end this right now," she said, her voice ice. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with hate, but fear flickered in them for the first time. "You don't have it in you," he hissed. Jessica leaned closer, her eyes locked on his. "Try me." The room was silent, the only sound the wind rattling the windows, the storm outside mirroring the tension inside. Finally, Ethan's shoulders slumped, and he looked away. "There's a man in Chicago," he said, his voice low. "Name's Vincent Moretti. He wants the ledger, thinks it's still out there. He's been looking for you for years." Jessica stepped back, lowering the pistol, her mind racing. She had heard the name before, whispers of a man who dealt in secrets and blood, a man who built his empire on the destruction of others. David looked at her, fear in his eyes. "What now?" he asked. Jessica holstered the pistol, her green eyes cold and clear. "Now we finish this," she said. She turned back to Ethan, who was watching her with a mixture of fear and rage. "You're going to help us," she said. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "And why would I do that?" Jessica leaned in, her voice low and deadly. "Because if you don't, I will leave you here for Vincent to find. And we both know what he'll do to you." Ethan's eyes widened, the color draining from his face as the reality of her words sank in. Jessica straightened, crossing her arms. "It's your choice, Ethan. Help us, or face him alone." Ethan's breathing was ragged, the weight of Jessica's threat hanging between them heavier than the storm still shaking the cabin walls. His eyes darted from Jessica's cold stare to David's tense posture, searching for a sign of weakness, a chance to regain control, but there was none. Jessica had shifted from the quiet mechanic into the force he remembered, the one who had walked through fire without flinching. "Fine," Ethan spat, his voice laced with venom. "What do you want from me?" Jessica uncrossed her arms, stepping closer, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Information. Everything you know about Vincent Moretti, where he is, who's working for him, how he plans to find me." Ethan's eyes narrowed, testing her resolve, but the pistol resting on her hip was enough to remind him she was serious. David moved to the corner, pulling a battered notebook from a drawer and opening it, ready to take notes. "Start talking," Jessica ordered. Ethan sighed, leaning back in the chair as far as the ropes would allow, his eyes unfocused as he began to speak. "Vincent has contacts in every major city, from Chicago to New York, and eyes on every shipment and transport that comes through. He doesn't just want the ledger because of the names in it. He wants it because it has the proof to control the people on those lists." Jessica's jaw tightened. She had always suspected the ledger was more than blackmail material. It was a map of power, a tool to dismantle or control entire networks of corruption and crime. "Who else knows I'm alive?" she asked sharply. Ethan hesitated, then continued. "A few of Vincent's inner circle know. He keeps them close, and they're loyal because they're afraid. He's been quietly searching for you for years, but your low profile made it hard. Then I got out, and word slipped that I might know where you were." David scribbled down names as Ethan listed them, his hand shaking only slightly. Jessica stood silently, processing each name, each connection, mapping it in her mind like she used to during missions when the world depended on precision and timing. She didn't have the luxury of mistakes now. "Does Vincent know you're here?" Jessica asked. Ethan's eyes flickered. "No, but if I don't check in, he'll send someone." Jessica took a deep breath, the weight of what was coming pressing into her lungs like ice. She turned to David, who was watching her, waiting for the decision they both knew she had to make. "We need to move before they come," David nodded, closing the notebook with a quiet snap. "Where will we go?" Jessica glanced back at Ethan, her eyes cold. "Chicago. If Vincent wants me, he can get me in his city, on my terms." Ethan laughed, though it was hollow, pain etched in every line of his face. "You're walking into a death trap." Jessica tilted her head, a humorless smile ghosting across her lips. "I've survived worse." They tied Ethan's feet tighter, gagging him to silence his protests as they prepared to leave. Jessica packed weapons, food, and supplies, moving with precise efficiency while David secured the cabin. The storm outside had begun to ease, the wind dropping into a cold hush as dawn threatened the horizon. Before they left, Jessica paused, looking around the cabin she had used as a safe haven for so long. The tools, the wood stove, the small cot in the corner where she had dreamed of peace, all of it was a chapter closing behind her. She stepped outside, the air biting at her skin, and helped David load Ethan into the back of the truck, securing him to the seat with reinforced straps. The engine started with a low growl, the headlights cutting through the mist as they pulled away from the cabin, leaving it behind in the creeping light of dawn. They drove in silence, the road winding through wet trees, the sky shifting from black to gray as the sun threatened to rise. Jessica's hands gripped the wheel, her mind moving through possibilities, planning for every scenario Vincent might throw at them. She glanced at Ethan through the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowed, watching her every move. "You're insane," he managed through the gag, his words muffled but clear enough. Jessica didn't look back, her eyes on the road ahead. "Maybe, but it's the only way this ends." David shifted in his seat, the notebook resting on his lap. "We'll need help," he said quietly. Jessica nodded, the city lights of Chicago a distant glow on the horizon. "We'll find it." And with that, they drove toward the storm they could no longer avoid, the past catching up with them in the shape of a man named Vincent Moretti, and Jessica Taylor ready to finish what she started, no matter what it cost her. The highway stretched ahead, empty under the pale dawn light, the rumble of the truck's engine the only sound breaking the cold silence inside the cab. Jessica's eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, catching Ethan's glare as he shifted against the restraints. David sat beside her, clutching the notebook, his mind working through the list of names and places Ethan had given them. Chicago was hours away, and every mile brought them closer to Vincent Moretti, the man who had sent shadows crawling into Jessica's quiet life, forcing her back into a world she had fought to leave behind. She tightened her grip on the wheel, the ghost of fear whispering in her mind, but she pushed it away, focusing on the mission, on the promise she had made to herself long ago, never to be powerless again. They stopped only once, pulling into an abandoned gas station on a side road to refuel and stretch. Jessica checked the perimeter, while David kept an eye on Ethan, who watched them with cold amusement, testing the ropes, but not fighting. Jessica's boots crunched on broken glass as she walked around the truck, scanning the tree line, every sound a potential threat. "Jess," David called softly, holding out a thermos of coffee. She took it, the warmth grounding her as she leaned against the truck, her eyes on the horizon. "We can still turn back," David said quietly, his eyes searching hers. Jessica shook her head, a small, tired smile on her lips. "There's no turning back, David. Not anymore." They resumed their journey, the city skyline appearing like jagged shadows against the brightening sky. Chicago, a place of steel and smoke, of streets that remembered every step you took, of alleys that swallowed secrets whole. Jessica felt the city's weight pressing on her chest as they entered the outskirts, the roads filling with morning traffic. They parked in an underground garage near the edge of downtown, the air heavy with oil and dust. Jessica opened the back door, meeting Ethan's eyes. "You try to run, I won't hesitate," she said calmly. Ethan smirked, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You need me alive," he replied. Jessica leaned closer, her green eyes cold. "Don't test me." They led him up to a small apartment above a closed auto parts store, a place Jessica had prepared years ago, just in case. The space was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a small cot, and blackout curtains covering the windows. Jessica tied Ethan to the chair, checking the knots twice before stepping back. "Talk," she ordered. Ethan looked around, shifting uncomfortably. "Vincent runs his operations out of a club downtown, under the cover of private security work. He has politicians in his pocket, cops on his payroll. If you walk in there, you're dead." Jessica crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "How do we get to him?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "There's a shipment coming in tonight. Documents he's expecting, something big enough that he'll be there in person." David's eyes widened. "What shipment?" Ethan's smirk returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Weapons, information, blackmail material, you name it. He's building leverage." Jessica's mind moved quickly, the pieces falling into place. "Where?" she demanded. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he finally answered. "Pier 47, midnight." Jessica turned away, pulling her phone from her pocket and dialing a number she hadn't used in years. The line rang once before a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" Jessica closed her eyes briefly before replying. "I need a favor." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "Jessica Taylor. I wondered when you'd call." She opened her eyes, her voice firm. "I need eyes on Pier 47 tonight." The voice on the line was calm. "Consider it done." She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket as she turned to David. "Get ready. Tonight, we end this." David nodded, swallowing hard, his resolve strengthening. "What about him?" he asked, nodding toward Ethan. Jessica glanced at Ethan, who looked back with a mix of fear and defiance. "He's coming with us." As the sun set, painting the city in shades of blood and gold, Jessica stood by the window, watching the lights flicker on across the skyline. The storm inside her was calm now, replaced by a quiet determination. She had been running long enough. It was time to finish what had started in the flames all those years ago. Night fell heavy over Chicago, the streets alive with sirens and distant horns as Jessica prepared. She moved around the small apartment, loading magazines, checking weapons, laying out earpieces and flashlights on the table with military precision. David sat silently, watching her, the weight of what they were about to do pressing into his chest like a cold stone. Ethan sat tied to the chair, his eyes following Jessica's movements, a thin smile on his lips that couldn't hide the fear beneath. "Pier 47, midnight," Jessica repeated, her voice calm. "We go in, get what we need, and end this." David took a breath, nodding as he stood, sliding a small pistol into the back of his belt. "What if it goes wrong?" he asked quietly. Jessica paused, looking at him with those steady green eyes. "Then we adapt." They left the apartment just after 11, the streets wet from an earlier rain, steam rising from sewer grates as the cold air rolled in from the lake. They drove in silence, the truck's tires humming against the slick asphalt. The city lights reflected off puddles, painting the world in fractured neon as they turned toward the industrial district. Pier 47 was quiet, the water dark and restless against the docks. Old shipping containers stood like silent giants, stacked in rows that created narrow corridors of shadow. Jessica parked the truck 2 blocks away, cutting the lights as she turned to Ethan. "If you try to run, I will end you," she said, her voice flat, final. Ethan smirked, but his eyes betrayed him. "I know." They moved through the shadows, Jessica leading, her boots silent on the cracked concrete. David followed, his breath short, the tension in the air wrapping around them like a wire pulled tight. Ethan walked between them, his hands bound but his eyes sharp, scanning the dark for threats only he could see. As they approached the pier, Jessica tapped her earpiece, the voice on the other end crackling to life. "Eyes on the south entrance. 2 guards, armed, casual." It was her contact, an old friend from another life, now a ghost in the city's security systems. Jessica replied with a quiet, "Copy," before signaling David to follow. They slipped between containers, the cold metal damp beneath their hands as they moved, each step calculated, each breath controlled. The pier was alive with quiet movement, men unloading crates, checking documents under the yellow glow of portable lights, their shadows long and shifting. Jessica crouched behind a container, pulling Ethan down beside her. "Where is he?" she hissed. Ethan's eyes scanned the scene before nodding toward a dark SUV parked near the water. "He'll be there, watching." Jessica followed his gaze, spotting the figure leaning against the SUV, a man in a dark coat, his posture casual but his eyes sharp, scanning everything. Vincent Moretti. She felt her pulse steady, her mind focusing as she formulated the next move. "David, stay here. Watch the perimeter." David swallowed, nodding, clutching his pistol like a lifeline. Jessica looked at Ethan. "You're coming with me." Ethan's smirk returned, but it was weaker now. "You really think he'll talk to you?" Jessica's eyes hardened. "He will." They moved closer, keeping to the shadows, the scent of oil and cold water heavy in the air. Jessica could hear the muffled conversation near the SUV, men laughing quietly, the metallic clink of weapons being checked. She stepped out of the shadows, pulling Ethan with her, the pistol pressed into his back. Vincent's eyes snapped to her instantly, his hand dropping to the gun at his side before freezing as he saw Ethan. A slow smile spread across Vincent's face, sharp and cold. "Jessica Taylor!" he called, his voice smooth, echoing across the water. "I was wondering when you'd stop hiding." Jessica stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Vincent's. "It ends tonight," she said. Vincent laughed, a low, dangerous sound. "You think you can walk into my city, into my business, and end anything?" He gestured to the crates being loaded onto trucks. "You're outnumbered, Jessica. Outgunned." Jessica's grip on the pistol tightened, the metal cold against her skin. "Maybe, but you're the one hiding behind men with guns." Vincent's eyes narrowed, his smile fading. "Careful." Jessica pushed Ethan forward, forcing him to stumble toward Vincent. "You want him? You want the ledger? Let's talk." The men around Vincent raised their weapons, the air snapping with tension. Vincent held up a hand, stopping them, his eyes locked on Jessica's. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, stepping forward. "But you're in over your head." Jessica took a breath, the world narrowing to the moment, to the promise she had made to herself she would never run again. The cold air snapped against Jessica's skin as she stared at Vincent, the world around them fading into the sound of waves lapping against the pier. The men with Vincent shifted, their fingers tightening on triggers, their eyes flicking between Jessica and Ethan. Jessica's pistol pressed into Ethan's back, a silent promise that she would not hesitate if he tried to betray her now. "You think you can negotiate with me?" Vincent's voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was sharp as a blade. "You're alone, Jessica." Jessica's green eyes did not blink, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Alone is how I work best," she replied. Ethan glanced back at her, sweat beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jessica dug the barrel of the gun deeper, silencing him. "Tell your men to lower their weapons, Vincent," Jessica ordered. Vincent's cold smile returned, but he raised a hand, signaling his men to lower their guns, though their eyes stayed sharp, their bodies coiled like springs. "What do you want?" Vincent asked, stepping closer, the shadows from the pier lights cutting across his face, highlighting the scars that lined his jaw. Jessica kept her stance firm. "You stop looking for me. You leave the people I care about alone, and you forget the ledger." Vincent's laughter echoed across the pier, a low, chilling sound that made Ethan flinch. "You really think you can walk in here and make demands?" His eyes narrowed, the amusement fading. "I could end you right now." Jessica's eyes didn't waver. "You could try, but then you lose your leverage, and we both know that Ledger is your real goal." Vincent's jaw tightened. "It's gone, Vincent," Jessica continued, her voice low. "Burned years ago. There's nothing left to find." Vincent studied her, trying to read the truth in her eyes, his mind working through calculations she could almost see. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of a foghorn on the lake. Ethan shifted again, his voice breaking through the tension. "She's telling the truth, Vincent. It's gone." Vincent's eyes flicked to Ethan, his lips curling in disgust. "You're a disappointment, Ethan," he spat, "dragging me into this mess for nothing." Ethan's shoulders slumped, the fear in his eyes clear now. Jessica took a breath, steadying herself. "This is your chance to walk away, Vincent." Vincent's gaze snapped back to her, the air between them charged with unspoken threats. Then, slowly, he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You really think you're in control here, Jessica?" Jessica felt it before she saw it. A flicker of movement in the shadows, the glint of metal. One of Vincent's men raised his weapon, aiming directly at her. Without thinking, Jessica shoved Ethan to the ground and dove to the side, the gunshot cracking through the night, the bullet shattering the crate behind where she had stood. Chaos erupted. Vincent's men opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing across the pier, sparks flying as bullets struck metal containers. Jessica rolled behind a stack of crates, returning fire with precision, each shot calculated, deliberate. She saw David moving in the shadows, taking cover and firing back, his face pale but determined. Ethan crawled toward a container, trying to escape, but Jessica's sharp command stopped him. "Don't even think about it!" she shouted, firing another shot that struck the ground inches from his hand, forcing him to freeze. Vincent moved through the chaos, shouting orders, his men repositioning, trying to flank Jessica and David. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the cold scent of the lake. Jessica's breathing was steady, her focus absolute as she moved from cover to cover, returning fire, each shot forcing Vincent's men to retreat. She saw Vincent duck behind the SUV, pulling out his own weapon, his eyes locking with hers across the chaos. For a moment, everything slowed. The flicker of muzzle flashes, the sparks on metal, the roar of the water against the docks. Jessica's eyes narrowed as she raised her pistol, lining up the shot, her finger tightening on the trigger. Vincent fired first. Vincent's shot tore through the air, the crack echoing across the pier as Jessica felt the bullet whip past her, close enough that the shock of it burned against her cheek. She didn't flinch. Her finger pulled the trigger, the recoil steady against her grip as her bullet struck Vincent's shoulder, spinning him backward against the SUV with a curse. Gunfire continued, deafening in the cold night, but Jessica moved forward, every step deliberate. She fired again, another precise shot that forced Vincent's men to scatter, dropping behind crates and containers, trying to find cover from the storm Jessica had become. David moved from behind a stack of pallets, firing at a man who tried to flank Jessica, the man dropping with a shout as David's bullet found its mark. "Jess, move left!" David yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Jessica obeyed, diving behind a container as bullets tore through the air where she had just been. Ethan, still bound, crawled toward a dropped weapon, desperation and fear on his face. Jessica saw him, her eyes narrowing as she aimed. "Don't!" she shouted. Ethan froze, his hand inches from the gun, his eyes meeting hers, wide and terrified. Another shot rang out, striking the ground beside Ethan's hand, forcing him to pull back. Vincent, clutching his bleeding shoulder, glared at Jessica as he raised his weapon again. "You should have stayed hidden," he roared, his voice raw with pain and rage. Jessica stepped out from cover, her eyes locked on him. "You should have left me alone," she replied, her voice calm, final. They fired at the same time. Jessica's bullet struck Vincent's weapon, shattering it in his hand, sending shards of metal flying. His scream of pain echoed as he dropped to his knees, clutching his ruined hand, blood dripping onto the concrete. Jessica approached, her boots steady, the chaos around her fading as the remaining gunmen dropped their weapons, realizing the fight was over. David ran to her side, his breathing heavy, eyes wide as he took in the scene. "It's over, Jess," he said, his voice shaking with relief. Jessica didn't take her eyes off Vincent, who glared up at her, hatred and pain twisting his face. "You think this ends with me?" Vincent spat, blood staining his teeth. "There will always be others." Jessica's green eyes were steady, unblinking. "Then let them come," she said, lowering her weapon but keeping it ready. "I'm done running." Vincent's head dropped, his energy draining as the weight of defeat settled on him. Police sirens began to echo in the distance, growing louder as the first flashes of red and blue lights reflected off the water. David looked at Jessica, fear flickering in his eyes. "What now?" he asked quietly. Jessica looked around the pier, the crates, the fallen men, the shattered remnants of a war she hadn't started but had finished. She holstered her weapon, turning to David. "Now we go home." As the police arrived, Jessica raised her hands, dropping her weapon carefully, her eyes meeting the officers with calm resolve. David did the same, stepping closer to her, their shoulders brushing in silent reassurance. Ethan was pulled to his feet by two officers, his eyes pleading as he looked at Jessica. She met his gaze, cold and steady. "This is on you," she said softly. The police began to secure the scene, arresting Vincent and his men, questioning Jessica and David briefly before leading them away from the chaos. The night was cold, the air sharp as they stepped away from the pier, the lights of the city reflecting in puddles as dawn began to break on the horizon. They stood in the street, the sirens fading, the world around them waking as the first light of day painted the buildings in gold and gray. David turned to her, his eyes searching. "Are you okay?" he asked. Jessica took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, clearing the last remnants of fear and adrenaline from her mind. "For the first time in a long time," she said, her voice calm, "I think I am." David smiled, relief flooding his features as he nodded. "What will you do now?" he asked. Jessica looked at the city, the streets alive with the promise of a new day. "Live," she said simply. "Finally live." They walked away from the pier, leaving behind the ghosts of the past, the weight of old battles lifted from their shoulders. Jessica knew the world was not done with her, that there would always be shadows, always be fights worth having. But for the first time, she was ready to face them on her terms, without fear, without regret, because Jessica Taylor was done hiding. She was done running. And as the sun rose over Chicago, she walked forward, ready for whatever came next.